So segment 2 is called Slippery Slope if Roe v. Wade is rolled back. The article in question here is called Here's What Could Happen If Roe v. Wade is Overturned. It's by Joe Hernandez at NPR. And really what this article focuses on is the fact that there have been, because Roe v. Wade has been in place, it has given states the opportunity to pass all sorts of laws concerning abortion without really giving thought to the consequences of those laws, because they knew that these were not going to be, enforceable, essentially, because Roe v. Wade was in place. So essentially, they could pass a whole bunch of these laws that had various draconian restrictions on the right to have an abortion, and not have to worry about the consequences of them or the practicalities of it, or even enforcement. But suddenly, if Roe v. Wade is now being rolled back, suddenly you have a whole bunch of states that have these so-called trigger laws in place, meaning that as soon as Roe v. Wade is overturned, then suddenly abortion will be illegal in a number of states. It's according to this, at least 20 states. There's going to be some form of limitation on the right to pursue an abortion and to receive an abortion. And so this has some very interesting potential consequences, and it's a lot of those cases where the state laws are talking about life beginning at conception, for instance, and that the life must be protected from that point on, because that's very interesting. And I'm sure SDB will have some things to say about this as well. But there are issues around the fact that some of our birth control methods, like intrauterine devices, for instance, don't actually prevent the conception. They prevent implantation of the embryo into the uterus. And so, in theory, IUDs are going to be illegal in some of these places. And that's a form of, contraception that's widely used. There's also issues around things like ectopic pregnancies. So an ectopic pregnancy is when the embryo implants in an area outside of the uterus. It's very commonly in the fallopian tube, that sort of connects the ovary to the uterus. And in ectopic pregnancy, the fetus is essentially never viable. There's no potential for a future life. There's no potential for a healthy infant from that pregnancy. And yet, because life begins at conception, these laws would require that the pregnant person carry that to its natural conclusion, which would be universally life-threatening for the pregnant person and lethal for the pregnancy. And so there's a lot of these issues that come up because of this, because of these trigger laws that were not put in place in a well thought out fashion. And, no one's really given them the proper thought to how they would be enforced and what the consequences would be. And so I think that if Roe v. Wade is overturned and some of these trigger laws go into effect, there's going to be a lot of political backlash, I imagine, when the first few women die of, hemorrhage from an ectopic pregnancy that they could not get removed, right? That they could not have, because that would constitute an abortion, an illegal abortion, because life began at conception, right? And so I think this is something that we really need to, I'd like to hear everyone's opinions on it. But I think that this is going to pose a lot of problems, both medically and legally and politically, for some of the people who have campaigned for those laws to go into effect.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of issues, especially within the OBGYN circles, that I'm not going into OBGYN, but I'm very terrified for a lot of my friends who are, because on the one hand, like we're legally bound to uphold the pillars of medical ethics. So we're talking beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. And you have abortion falls into all of those categories. So you have these ethics that you have to follow, but then now you're simultaneously legally bound to break them, because like we're talking about this as ectopic pregnancy, or another example that I like to use is the inevitable abortion, where you have a rupture of membranes prior to 20 weeks, where you might have a heartbeat and you might have a viable gestation that has to be removed, because otherwise you're going to get sepsis. So like you have somebody coming to you who is in distress and who needs help. And on the one hand, you want to help them, but you know that if you do, you might be going to prison for helping. But then if you don't, sure, you avoid prison, but now you've neglected somebody that you had a duty to help. So this is in conflict with everything that we're taught, and it violates this relationship between the doctor and the patient. And it's, I think, like, and it's interesting too that this is so criminalized, as opposed to in other. And I'm not lumping this in with malpractice, but if this were to be treated as malpractice, like, you're not usually going to a criminal trial for malpractice. It's handled in with the medical boards and with a civil trial. So it's interesting that this is a criminal offense that can get you a felony charge.
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy American physicians at this point.
Dr. Hafer, I wanted you to also chime in, and I wanted to speak a bit on the whole criminality of a lot of these particular trigger laws. Go ahead.
Well, and as you mentioned before, some of this has been political. That is to say, the laws were put into effect by politicians who could run on these things without having to worry about the consequences to actual human beings. Mm-hmm. So, they could run on it and they could get their base all excited by it. But on the other hand, they didn't have to really deal with it. It was just kind of this this thing that they could talk about that essentially had no real consequences. So they could be as extreme as they wanted to be, and that just got their base excited. So there are all these laws on the books that were put there largely to make the legislators look good in the eyes of certain extreme portions of their constituency. And now they may actually wind up going into effect. And yeah, you're going to have the problem that people are going to die. I mean, I'm not joking when I say that, and I'm not exaggerating. If you have an ectopic pregnancy, if it is not dealt with medically, if the implanted fetus is not removed, basically the woman is going to die. And the fetus is doomed. I'll say that again. It's doomed from the start. The moment it implants on a fallopian tube, it is doomed. So there aren't even competing interests there, but this is not going to matter with these trigger laws.
Yeah. I pulled up a few stats specifically speaking on maternal and infant mortality rates in the United States. And amongst the other developing countries, the United States is like the worst. For a highly industrialized, wealthy nation, our infant and maternal mortality rate is abysmal. And I can just even think about having reproductive rights actually overturned in certain states, that it's going to only get worse. You all are familiar with the Guttmacher Institute and they actually conducted a study to actually gauge the reasons why most people get abortions. And about 60% of people who actually choose to get abortions were about 200% of the federal poverty line, including 30% were of who were living in poverty, and 31% of the respondents were Black, African American, and 19% were Latina or Hispanic. And I was even looking at like this whole issue concerning like who these trigger laws would affect adversely the most, and it's definitely going to be poor people, and people who happen to be in largely marginalized groups are going to see the worst effect of it. And if we talk about criminalization, a lot of these particular trigger laws, like that we have seen in Texas and Mississippi, and I believe Idaho, I believe Arizona passed one not too long ago. There is a punishment that is going to be ensued for people who either choose an abortion or even have like the a semblance of helping somebody to get an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, we have already the highest prison population in the world in the United States. And can you just imagine like how the prison population actually becoming even more so an issue just because of these particular laws, only because a person said that I don't have the resources to carry my pregnancy to term. And even part of some of my other, discourses that I had for people who happen to be pro-life, air quotes, was saying about, well, what about adoption? I don't know if anyone is familiar with the adoption rates in the United States, but they're kind of shitty too. Yeah, we're more than 5 minutes in, so I can cuss. So yeah, they're very shitty. And we even seen where African American children are actually less likely to be adopted out and actually stay in the system longer than any other group of children. And and even like if you're even looking at the wealth gap right now, there's been a lot of talk in the news about like the racial wealth gap, and even if looking at Black women, they're about 90%. There's a 90% wealth gap between Black women and white men in the United States right now. So and even going back to even like what you all were talking about specifically about topical pregnancies and even like other issues concerning the mother's health, the mother's health that could be in jeopardy if they happen to develop a pregnancy that is not viable for the infant or themselves. A lot of the trigger laws do not keep those things in mind. So they are definitely based on things that are not socially nor scientifically viable. And yeah,
The
I
thing
need
that
to
I
breathe.
find so confusing is that there's a lot of these laws, and sorry, there's a lot of these laws, and then when you read the article, like even the one that we are talking about today, they'll say something like, except in cases of rape and incest, or this law doesn't even make exceptions for rape and incest, as though that makes it like, as though that constitutes something different, right? It's like on one side, these trigger laws are saying like, no, it's a life, it has inherent value, it like we can't violate that, except if it's the product of a rape or incestuous relationship. Like, I don't understand why that fact would alter the value in their eyes of the product of it, right? Like these laws don't even make internal sense. Like they're not even internally consistent to me. It's that I find like so bizarre.
Well, I can answer the question for you if you want. It's because with rape and incest, it was not a woman choosing to have sex.
Right.
So this is all about punishing women for having sex. And
But
so
that's
the
not what
only
they say it's about,
oh,
right?
that's why
yeah.
I'm
So
pointing it out.
yeah, so it's totally like they're betraying their true motivation by
Right.
putting in those sort of those caveats.
And
Right.
can I
Go right
Can I
ahead. Sure.
and can
Yeah,
I chime in as well? Like,
yes,
because I
please.
don't want to forget too that this doesn't only impact women. Like, I'm a trans man. This
Mhm.
impacts the trans community, and we're often left out of this conversation. And it's really sad, and it affects us, trans men and non-binary people in ways that are not easily thought of, because if you haven't lived as one of us, it's kind of difficult. But pregnancy requires the cessation of testosterone therapy because it is a teratogen. So you're asking somebody to stop their gender affirming care, and which causes more dysphoria, but then also losing the ability to go stealth in men's spaces. If you look like a man and you also look very pregnant, that can be dangerous to go into, because you're not allowed in women's spaces. You're not allowed
Right.
in men's spaces now.
Right.
Like, you don't have a space, and you could very well be the target of violence in that case.
Yeah, and we actually have I actually have seen that to be the case of where persons, who happen just to have a uterus, if they happen to be masculine presenting, yet they're pregnant, and they chose, like, I'm going to actually have a baby with myself and my partner, then from other sides, especially like from cisgender heterosexual men, it's a problem, and it can definitely be the case of a lot of violence to be exacted upon that particular group of people. So these laws in of itself don't even, as Ben just mentioned, even keep any of those things into consideration. It's, in all in all, they're just very extremely dangerous. And it's kind of even interesting, like, to your point, Dr. Hafer, when you were saying that, well, that we're just going to actually just punish women, or when women presenting people to, because you decide to have sex, right? Even if you are actually having sex and you're not necessarily married, or if you, happen to not necessarily have a condom at that particular time, or whatever, there's still like this whole punishment, again, to those who are saying that, okay, yeah, I'm going to have sex, but because I guess it's not in this particular confined of a particular institution, it's wrong. I don't know. I want to open that up to the floor, and just kind of get your thoughts on that, everyone.
Well, the short version is that conservative Christians are frightened out of their minds by happy female sexuality. They don't like it. They want it to be owned by a man, basically, and be in the service of a man. And so, basically, women having sex for fun is not something they want to think about. And then all of the other sort of, not in service of a heterosexual man aspects of this, whether it's a trans man or whatever, all of those things are kind of the same in the same pot that way, because it is not, women having sex specifically so as to serve a man and give him children. And anything that isn't that is just something that's considered frightening and, well, frankly, wrong. And
It
so they
comes
don't
back to
want it.
what you were saying about like natural law, right? That seems very rooted in Abrahamic faith traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And yeah, we're definitely back to the natural law, folks. That is to say, sort of conservative, originally Catholic, but as I said, very much supported now by conservative Protestants as well. This is conservative Catholic dogma. And these folks are also against LGBTQ rights and same sex marriage and everything else like that. If you ever want to read a document that is simultaneously really insulting to your intelligence and very frightening, read the Manhattan Declaration, which was, again, written by this guy, Dr. Robert George, who's at Princeton. And if you read it, it's all about all the things we would expect about same-sex marriage and abortion and all of these kinds of things. And it basically is presenting it as simultaneously religious, but no, not really religious. Look, we're busy being secular. But it's also an example of just how poor their reasoning actually is. It's kind of for that reason that I recommend it, because it is a document that has been very influential. But when you look at how bad their arguments actually are, it's kind of frightening that they have that much power. It talks about how women should not be forced to have abortions, for example. Well, we are all agreed that women should not be forced to have abortions, but they are essentially making this very paternalistic argument that that no woman would decide to have an abortion if she were not forced in some way or another. So you kind of get the idea here. It's basically women as not possessing agency. And anyway, this is what natural law is about, and it is unfortunately far too powerful as a legal theory in our country.
Ben, how about you? You look like you're stirring on my far left.
Oh no, I'm just kind of taking stuff in, and this is all like it's keeping people down, and I want to laugh at the fact that people are so insecure about other people, existing, but at the same time, like, why? Like, why are you trying so hard to make us all miserable? And like going back to what Cynthia was saying about cost being such a big factor, it really is. Like, poverty is huge in this, and this, like, preventing people from being in charge of their pregnancy is keeping people poor. And like thinking about, even if this were to like go to the States, like, you have some people with a lot of financial privilege who might be able to overcome some of those barriers, like people crossing state lines to be able to get terminations. But again, that's a lot of cost that not a lot of people have. The cost of prenatal care is really high because you have to be constantly monitored. Cost of delivery, cost of postpartum care, cost of your pediatrician for that entire childhood period, the cost of lost income due to, like, if you have to go on leave and if your job doesn't provide you with parental leave, which many don't, you're losing income there. And the cost of, let's say you were a high risk pregnancy, or even if you're not necessarily high risk right away, but something happens, that's more medical bills for complications of said pregnancy. So there's no way for someone without that privilege to win here.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just going to add in that it turns out, surprise, surprise, that women are actually very good judges of when they can support a pregnancy and when they can support and raise a child. And this is something that is being deliberately ignored. Again, is the whole idea of female agency. It's not only keeping people poor, but, women, it's not allowing women to make decisions, not just about their bodies, but about their lives. And as I said, and as you have pointed out, where poverty is concerned and so on, women are actually pretty good at figuring out what they need to do.
I wanted to go back to that piece when you were talking about prenatal care, Ben. I was actually discussing this episode with my mom before we were going to record last night, and I was telling her about all the different research that I was, just doing, just so that I can actually sound like that. I can string two sentences together with all these medical people, and it kind of brought up some, I guess, like some old ghost, specifically with me. I remember um, I was in 2007, early 2008. I was pregnant, and I was with the father for a while, but the relationship was very toxic. So I decided to leave the relationship, and 2 weeks later, I found out that I was pregnant. And I did mull around possibly terminating the pregnancy because I did not want to have anything to do with the father. And I knew that if I had the child, that would happen. Now, I ultimately decided not to terminate the pregnancy. I would also like to say at that particular time I was a theist, and but I ended up losing the child anyway. And the funny thing about it was is that I had insurance. I was working. I had a pretty decent job, and I was high risk at the time, and I was actually seeing a doctor on the regular basis to monitor me while I was going through my pregnancy. The night before I actually miscarried, I had an appointment with the doctor, and they told me that they could not hear a heartbeat, but they sent me home. The next day, I started to get very dizzy. I was throwing up blood, and I had to be taken to the emergency room right away. I waited in the emergency room for over 8 hours before I saw a doctor. By that time, I was taken to the back. The baby was, as we know, was dead, and the fetus was dead, and it fell out while I was by myself, not with a doctor. I had to scream for a nurse to help me, so that they can actually make me give birth right then to a dead fetus. And I don't necessarily think, and that happens a lot, especially to Black women in the United States. So this is not a story that is not unfounded from a lot of women, especially Black women who happen to be pregnant, even if they have good jobs, even if they have a decent education or anything like that. As I stated before, the infant and maternal mortality rates in the United States is absolutely abysmal, and because we still have issues concerning implicit bias and racism also in the healthcare system. And actually doing this particular portion of all the rolling back that Roe v. Wade is going to happen to do, or the damage is going to do, per se, especially when you're looking at the attack on abortion pills, attack on contraception, because contraception, like IUDs and and pills, are not always just so that you don't get pregnant. A lot of times they actually are put in place to fix issues that's going on in a person's body. Um, it's going to be a point where stuff like this is going to be even more prevalent, and it's really really messed up that it's not something that is being really discussed in the way that it should be, at least not in the lawmaker's chair. And before we move on, I just want to get everyone's final thoughts, and then we're going to go on to our final segment. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Hafer, then MD Aware, and then student Dr. Ben.
Well, I mean, I'm very moved by what you had to say there. And this is absolutely the case that, all of these things work together. So, and poverty is going to be a complicating factor at every single step in a person's pregnancy and in a person's ability to raise their child. Or not raise their child, but it's going to complicate absolutely every step of the journey. It's going to complicate whether as student Dr. Ben was saying, whether they can travel out of state if they want to terminate. But it's going to complicate getting proper prenatal care. It's going to complicate getting housing. It's going to complicate being able to further your education. All those things wind up adding up. And this is definitely going to wind up keeping a lot of people in poverty. And, I can say, as someone who teaches human anatomy and physiology, I know the people who try to educate their way out of poverty by going into healthcare, taking anatomy and physiology, and then they can go on and be accepted into a nursing program, or into lots of other healthcare programs. And I see the struggles that people go through to do this. And, all of those different things, they are in principle, all of these different sort of things that complicate things are in principle surmountable. But the more that you put in place, the harder the more obstacles there are in somebody's life, the more it's going to be hard to get yourself and your family out of poverty. And that's just the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I am aware.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add, except I wish I could say that I was surprised that a move like this was going to disproportionately affect the traditionally marginalized populations, but I'm really not surprised by that, right? It just reaffirms to me the need for things like medical care to be socialized. And again, I'm speaking from the context of a Canadian physician who works in a socialized medical system, which is not perfect by any means. And we still have the challenges that you alluded to, Cynthia, about, issues with racial biases in the way people are managed, and gender biases in the way people are managed. But I mean, I think that if a similar thing were to happen in Canada, the effects would be not as significant, I would hope, because the financial barriers would be less. I mean, I can't imagine the fear that people in the States are feeling. I imagine they're feeling very, very trapped and betrayed. And I don't know. All I can do is express my sympathy. And if I were qualified, I'd open my doors to perform abortions on whoever wanted to make the trek north. But that's not my field.
I got you. Thank you. And finally, Ben.
I'm just gonna keep this short and sweet, but this is not an isolated issue. There's intersectionality with all of this, and we can't forget that. So just because you don't like one particular thing, think through the consequences that it's going to have on everybody else, because it's unlikely to only affect one thing.
Agreed.